When former President Gerald Ford decided to pardon Richard Nixon in 1974, he believed he was doing what was in the best interests of the country. He believed that a long, protracted trial that could drag on for months would do more harm than good. In his pardon, he wrote, "The tranquility to which this nation has been restored could be irreparably lost by the prospects of bringing to trial a former president of the United States," end quote. There are clear parallels between Nixon and Donald Trump, the first president ever to be impeached twice and the first president who has faced a criminal indictment, let alone two and possibly a third. But let's be clear, the current times in which we live are vastly different from the Watergate era. Donald Trump must be held to account for his actions, but it is essential to consider the delicate balance between the necessity to prosecute Trump and exacerbating the ever-growing polarization in America. The GOP's embrace of America's paranoid fringes is no longer an afterthought. It is a stark reality. Trump's presidency has embraced and encouraged the resurgence of the white nationalist movement, whose members now police our nation's libraries, our school board meetings, and various venues across America, menacing and harassing those who are not aligned with their beliefs. Trump's cult-like following within the GOP has made it politically costly for any Republican to deviate from his extremist rhetoric, fearing alienation from a party that demonstrates fealty to him time and time again. Trump has also cynically projected his legal woes onto his supporters, painting any indictment of him as an attack on all of them and pledging to get revenge on their behalf.
Every time the radical left Democrats, Marxists, communists, and fascists indict me, I consider it a badge, a great, great, beautiful badge of honor and courage. Because I'm being indicted for you. In 2016, I declared, "I am your voice." Today, I add, "I am your warrior. I am your justice. And for those who have been wronged and betrayed, I am your retribution."
Polling over the last several months indicates that with each new indictment, Trump's popularity grows among his extremist Republican base. Considering all these factors, prosecuting this particular former president becomes an entirely different ballgame. However, it is a ballgame that it is entirely necessary to play. Excusing the behavior of a defiant and habitual lawbreaker with fascist ambitions would raise serious questions about the integrity of our democratic system, and it could undermine the very bedrock of our democratic principles. I want to dig deeper into this topic. I'm joined by two of the smartest people on this that I know. Anne Applebaum is a Pulitzer Prize-winning historian and staff writer at The Atlantic. She's also the author of several books, including Twilight of Democracy, The Seductive Lure of Authoritarianism. Timothy Snyder is a professor of history at Yale University, a permanent fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences, and author of On Tyranny, 20 Lessons from the 20th Century. I've relied so much on the two of you over the years to understand things that are going on, so it's a real privilege to have you both here to address this issue. And there's a specific question that I want to address with you. And I've already received tweets about this morning from people who think this is an unnecessary conversation, that there shouldn't be any conversation about the potential risks of prosecuting and finding Donald Trump guilty of the things that he has been charged with and may be charged with. It may be entirely necessary and important to do so, but it could further polarize the country. I'd love to get your take on that.
So, yes, I think it's important to talk about the risks because there are risks. But it's also important to look at historical precedents. So you mentioned one in your introduction, and this was Nixon. The reason why that situation was so different from this one is that Nixon was condemned by his own party. So Republicans in Congress, Republicans in the country, not all of them, but many of them wanted him to resign. They participated in the Watergate hearings process. And by the time Gerald Ford became president, there was a consensus, at least within the party leadership, that that he was well out of the White House. We don't have that now. We have a Republican Party that is encouraging Trump, that is spreading the same kinds of messages, that is questioning whether January 6th even was an insurrection at all, even though, as we know more and more, we have more and more evidence that it was. And so in that circumstance, it's very important that the law proceeds further because there isn't anything else that can stop that further radicalization of the Republican Party. So although I agree with some of the questioners that it's important to, it's important to ask I agree with your point that it's important to look at the risks. It's also important to understand why this is different. And let me mention one more precedent, which is that of Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, who was released from prison. This is, way back in the early days before he'd been elected. He was released from prison after an attempted insurrection, and this actually encouraged his followers more. So we also have to think about what are the risks of not condemning him, of not carrying the January 6th investigations to their obvious end. Because if we don't do it, then we give actual more impetus to that movement.
Tim, across the world, including in Eastern and Central Europe, but in America in the Civil Rights Movement, in South Africa during the anti-apartheid movement, in India during the independence movement, there were people who knowingly broke laws for an honorable end, to change oppressive laws. Donald Trump has managed to squirm his way into that crowd, at least with his own supporters. It sounds outrageous, but it's actually happening. He is convincing people, as Mussolini did. I think Mussolini called himself an avenger. Donald Trump calls himself their retribution. How is it that you separate these things? How is it that you explain to people that, no, these were actual laws he broke? Whether he believed he won the election or he didn't, he undertook things to break the law in America that undermined democracy, not for the gain, not for the benefit of some better result.
I mean, the fundamental difference is sometimes people will break laws in the name of a principle, and that principle can itself be the rule of law. That's actually the foundation of the history of the United States of America. The common law tradition that we inherited from Britain assumed that the king was not above the law. The basis of the American Revolution, therefore, was holding the king to the law. And once we had done that, we then wrote up that common law in the form of a written constitution, which made it very clear that there would be no king and that nobody would be above the law. The president is someone who holds office for a certain period of time. It's not a special person who is somehow above the law. When Mr. Trump talks about being retribution or he threatens revenge, what he's doing is that he is using fascist language. He's using language from an entirely different political system, one which says that that law doesn't matter, that there's no difference between the leader and the party and the state and the people, that everything ultimately comes down to the whim and the will of one person. If we want to get ourselves into a fascist system, then the thing to do, as Ann suggests, is not to prosecute Mr. Trump. Because the meaningful polarization in this country, I believe, is between people who believe in law and people who don't. And the people who don't believe in law are going to be galvanized and encouraged by a powerful figure, someone who has been president and wishes to be president. And of course, that's the difference.
Yes.
The person who is the leader and has the power is now calling upon people to break the law.
And this concept of vengeance, this idea that I was in power, I'm still pretty powerful, and I could be ultimately powerful again, has come to play in an ad that Donald Trump put out a few days ago on, I think on Thursday, on Truth Social. And let's just play this, and I want to get your take on it.
If you around with us, if you do something bad to us, we are going to do things to you that have never been done before.
I'm going to do to you things that have never been done before. And by the way, there was a lot more to that ad that is sinister and dark. But I think to Tim's point, this is important. This isn't a guy on the outside saying, I want my piece of this fair system that America is. This is we're going to come in, we're going to clean house. We mentioned fascists and communists and Marxists and all sorts of people. There's an implicit threat here combined with what he said last weekend to Maria Bartiromo on Fox Business about what a great judge Aileen Cannon is and what a patriot she is, and how we need more judges like her to do the right thing. There is the messaging of a guy who thinks he's going to be back in office, who is telling people, I'm going to find the ones who are bad to me and get rid of you or do something to you, and I'm going to find the ones who are good to me, and you're going to be part of my administration.
So you don't have to look at Marxists or fascists or anything else. I don't think it's necessary to go outside of our system to understand what it is that Trump is trying to do. So as Tim just said, we have a system that is rule of law, meaning that the law is higher than any individual, the law is higher than any person, and we have a written constitution, we have a legal system that everybody is responsible to. What he's saying is that he wants to change that system and establish what's called elsewhere in the where else in the world, rule by law. In other words, the law is what the person in charge says it is. So the law is what the powerful say it is. Judges are not independent actors who owe their allegiance to the Constitution. Judges owe their allegiance to the president or to whoever is the person who has power. And there's a whole range of other institutions that Trump has been attacking that operate along the same principle. The military, for example. This spring, I was at a commissioning ceremony for young military officers. They don't swear fealty to President Biden or any president. They swear fealty to the Constitution. Their obligation is to the constitutional system.
Right.
One of the reasons why the part of the Trumpist right, the MAGA movement, has been attacking the military is precisely because of that, because the military is not a body that will fight for Trump or for them or for any particular person or group. It's a body that is meant to be loyal to the constitutional system. You could say the same of the FBI. You could say the same of a whole range of institutions that they are now taking aim at. And so, again, what he is seeking to do is to change the nature of our political system and make it something different. It doesn't matter what you call that new system, but it's definitely not the American system that we've known until now.
I'm so grateful to both of you, not just for now, but for all the times that we've talked and you've taken time, and many times you've been in other parts of the world and it's been ungodly hours. I really do recommend to my viewers that in this crucial time, they read both of you, they follow both of you and the things that you do. Anne Applebaum is an historian and a staff writer for The Atlantic. Dr. Timothy Snyder is a history professor at Yale University. Stay where you are another hour. Hey, by the way, before we go, I just want to say one thing. On this show, I often have to remember in my mind to make distinctions between people who are ideologically conservative and people who are Republicans. They are not one and the same. And I did actually make that mistake. I referred to Max Baucus as a Republican. He's not. He's a Democrat. He's always been a Democrat. He is what you would call a conservative Democrat. He broke with his party on issues of guns, on issues of taxes and things like that. And as a result, he was considered conservative by his own party, but he is a Democrat. Those comments that he made on climate were particularly important coming from a conservative Democrat. Stay where you are. Another hour of Velshi starts after a quick.